Hey guys, my name's Trevor Curry, and I will be discussing the topic of guilt and health today. So first, real quickly, I'd like to go over the meaning of the word guilt. It comes from an old English word meaning delinquency. Um, Guilt is defined as feelings of culpability, especially for imagined offenses or from a sense of inadequacy or self-reproach. So where do we learn guilt? Guilt is taught to children by their parents at a very young age by a parent displaying some form of disappointment or discipline towards that child after he or she performed an act that the parent did not approve of or displayed some sort of behavior that the parent didn't approve of. And the way this works at first when the child is young is because the child is always looking for their parents' love and approval, and when they do something, they can tell when their parent is upset and does not give them that approval or love back. Then the child feels that guilt naturally, from the reaction of their parent, looking for that love and that affection that just doesn't come immediately after that action or behavior. I found it interesting that self-guilt, or the feelings of guilt about oneself develops around 18 months old, and then moral guilt does not develop until around 4 or 5 years old. And the moral guilt takes longer because it takes a few years for a child to learn what actually is moral or immoral, as dictated by the community where they live or by their parents or any other social influence. 18-month-olds don't have that cognitive ability to understand that kind of stuff, so that's why it takes to about 4 or 5 years old. So everyone kind of thinks of guilt as this negative, unhealthy thing, which I think for the most part it tends to be, but there's a healthy side and a positive side, and this kind of briefly talks about it, and I'll go into it a little more in the next two slides. But a healthy guilt is a way to keep our actions or potential actions socially and morally acceptable. So it kind of keeps us on track. Unhealthy guilt occurs when we set unrealistically high standards for ourselves and feel inadequate or guilty when we fail to reach these standards. And it can also occur when we look up to someone and that person expresses disappointment with our actions or behaviors. When we're too involved in their reaction, we feel too guilty for how someone else feels about our actions. So I'd like to touch on the positive emotion of guilt and how it is a positive force sometimes. Guilt can be a healthy thing in that it is a feeling we experience when we do something that we judge by our own moral code to be wrong. So it's kind of like that internal, conscious, basically. It's that internal regulator. It can occur in many people just by having the urge to do something that they believe is wrong, or even have a thought about committing an act of wrongdoing. Healthy guilt tends to keep us in line with socially acceptable pathways and functioning as useful individuals. So it keeps us in line, like I said earlier. And that's where I think the biggest positives from guilt come about. And also because guilt is a painful thing, people often find a way to soothe their feelings by making up for their actions in some way. So for example, you do something that makes you feel guilty, some wrongdoing or something to someone else. The positive way guilt will influence you is to make it up to that person, or do something positive for another group of people or another person to make you feel better. So that's the positive spin on it. And these types of repairs are useful because they can help you re-strengthen your ties to the community that you have damaged. So that's some of the positives. And next we'll go over more people know about is the negative emotion of guilt. That guy's neck looks a little broken under the pressures of guilt, and that's totally what happens sometimes. So guilt occurs when we establish unreasonably high standard for ourselves, like I mentioned earlier, and with the result that we feel guilty by failing to maintain those high standards Um, that's definitely a way it can be a negative influence on you. And this kind of guilt is really rooted in low self-esteem, and it can also involve a form of distorted self-importance, where we assume anything that happens is our responsibility. It goes back to what Dr. Minarek said in class. You have the different ends of the spectrum where you take responsibility for everything that happens or nothing. And this end, the guilty spectrum, I guess, is when you assume that everything that happens is your responsibility and you feel guilty for everything. So that's that unhealthy part of that spectrum there. And then also, it can be translated onto other people, and where you have these expectations that are too high that you expect of your family, friends, or colleagues, and you can push that onto them too. And that's another negative, just a negative side of guilt. And then also, as we'll see in the next slide here, I have written down excess guilt is definitely harmful to the body. So let's take a look at the physiology of guilt here. I'm assuming that guy is feeling guilty with all those judging eyes on him, and maybe smoking a cigarette and sweating is his only way to feel better. But I actually looked at a study that compared those who had high guilt levels with those who had lower guilt levels and related to pleasurable activities, and they actually found that there were higher levels of illness-fighting immunoglobulin A levels in those who took pleasure in activities with less guilt. So those who did not show as much guilt actually had higher levels of that immunoglobulin A, which is it's an immune level booster, more or less. So their immune systems are stronger. So I have written here, studies have shown that guilt weakens the immune system, and that's what that study I read proved. And then also, guilt is similar to stress in that it releases cortisol, and as we know, cortisol is a stress hormone that our body makes as a part of its fight or flight response, and is designed to mobilize our energy stores and activating systems, which may be necessary to fight off a potential threat. But when there is not a potential threat and we have this long-term exposure, that can increase blood pressure and put you at risk for heart disease, diabetes, and also it can lead prolonged exposure to guilt, or this excess guilt, has been proven to lead to depression and anxiety disorders. So having too much guilt for too long can turn from these feelings of guilt about something you've done to an anxiety that you can't live up to these standards, or that you're guilty all the time about something you've done, or even depression. So let's go into just these two types of guilt that I kind of touched on here. And there's past guilt and then anticipated guilt. And past guilt is pretty much what it sounds like. Thinking about the inconsistencies of one's past behaviors in relation to your own personal standards, or remembering an immoral or unaccepted act that you may have done in the past and holding on to that guilt about it, well into the future. And that's the next point, is the inability to move on past something that has been done, or behavior, or something that causes guilty feelings. That inability to move on keeps that past guilt around. Anticipated guilt is the anticipation of a future violation of one's values or moral codes. So looking into the future, realizing, ooh, I'm already feeling guilty about something I haven't done, that's anticipated guilt. That cake I really want to eat, I'm going to go eat that cake. I feel guilty about it, but I haven't even done it yet. And that can cause certain actions or inactions. So if you're feeling guilty about eating the cake that you haven't even eaten yet, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll go have a salad and go to the gym instead. Or maybe you will eat the cake, and then that anticipated guilt will turn into past guilt if you still feel guilty about it after you've done that. So here's some examples of guilt, and there's my eating too much cake example. I think I used that example because I still have birthday cake left over from last month, and it's still really good, but I don't feel guilty about it because I love it. But obviously this girl on the left here in the picture is feeling guilty for what she's done for a Klondike bar, and I'm not so sure we want to know what she did, but Next example, oversleeping, missing classes. Seniors probably don't feel as guilty about this as freshmen, but and there's missing deadlines. And this next one I found particularly interesting, and I had to do a little more research on what this meant. And suppressing one's sexual preferences. So this one's interesting because it affects a lot of young adults and teenagers that are not necessarily comfortable with their sexual preferences or their sexual orientation, because society places a lot of demands on this age group to act and behave in certain ways. And so if someone is, say for example, someone's attracted to someone of the same sex, well, society tends to place pressure on them to be heterosexual, and so that can cause feelings of guilt in that individual so intense that they'll even hide who they really are by pretending to be whoever society wants them to be. And this can also get into the guilt leading to depression, anxiety, and even worse. Sometimes this kind of stuff can cause the worst, and suicide or anything like that. So that one I found really interesting. And you don't necessarily think of guilt in that sense. Everyone thinks of guilt as the cookie jar, or like the next point, committing crimes. I think everyone's heard stories of someone committing a crime and turning themselves in, or they steal something and they give it back after their guilty conscience, quote unquote, leads them to do so. And then right there, thinking about past events it kind of relates to all those things there. So here we have overcoming guilt, and the thing I thought was interesting, it's just not really a magic solution to overcoming guilt. Like anything else, you got to work on it. Really, it helps to look at the source of the guilt to see where it's coming from. If it's from an internal source, if you're putting the guilt on yourself, you can deal with that appropriately. Or if the guilt is coming from an external source, from someone else or society, then you can deal with that in its own way too. So that really helps to look where the guilt is coming from. And also, you need to determine whether or not the guilt is a positive or negative influence. So for example, I'll go back to my cake. If you eat that cake and you feel guilty about it, maybe that guilt will lead you to change your diet and exercise patterns in a positive way. And if that's the case, that guilt is a positive thing and doesn't necessarily, it's not going to do you harm. But on the flip side of that coin, if you eat too much cake and you feel guilty about it and it leads you to, let's say, eating disorders or unhealthy habits like that, that's a negative way that guilt can affect you. So that's a good thing to look at how it's influencing your actions. And then also, if you have trouble dealing with guilt and you need to overcome it, talk to trusted friends, family, or even get professional help if you need to do so. I attached this link here. I think it's about a 5-minute video, so I won't play it now. But go ahead and check that out if you're interested. It's pretty good. This guy talks more about the negative effects of guilt. So I thought that was a pretty good video. And then here I have some discussion questions for you guys. What kind of things make you feel guilty, and how do you deal with those guilty emotions? Then next one, has there ever been a time when you made someone else feel guilty in order to avoid dealing with your own guilt? So that one's kind of deep. Just let me know. And then the final one, have you ever used guilt to positively influence your own or someone else's life? And if so, how? So if you've used guilt, in a positive way, then in your own life or someone else's, that'd be cool to hear how. So, source for you guys, and thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Goodbye.